What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Expeditions Samurai, which is the fourth installment in the Expeditions series and the follow-up to a game I really loved, Expeditions Rome. This game is actually releasing into early access tomorrow, August 7th, and you are seeing this video on August 6th. That is, of course, possible because Campfire Cabal reached out and asked if I would like to take a look at this game, which is, of course, how I'm bringing you this video. So, a good bit to go over here, but let's start with the basics. As I said, this game is launching into early access tomorrow. It is launching for $30 US and will be on a 34% launch discount for that first week. And what is going to be available is the first act of the game, which is roughly 6 to 8 hours of content. Now, in the future, they're planning about 4 different updates between now and release. And while we don't have timing on any of these, they've provided this roadmap of roughly what to expect, just so you know. I was pretty excited to take a look at this game specifically because of Expeditions Rome, which if you have not played it is a fantastic CRPG that sees you acting as a stand-in for Julius Caesar. This time around, however, rather than ancient Rome, we are instead looking at the Edo period of Japan. More specifically, the game starts in 1600, which is when the Edo period starts, or potentially 1603 depending on who you ask, but basically as the Tokugawa shogunate is getting established. And this time around we are a stand-in for William Adams, which you should be familiar with if you've played Neo, who have their own take on William Adams. But William Adams was a traveler that arrived in Japan. I believe he was actually the first Englishman to do so, and he became very involved in the culture in Japan and wound up serving the shogunate while he was there, and that happened for roughly 20 years before his death in 1620. Now, I will also say, comparatively, things are a little more loose here in terms of like specific details and everything, but that's kind of the gist of what they're going for, and that's where the game starts, with us sailing on a ship trying to set up a trade negotiation with Japan. And while we are meant to be escorting an ambassador in the game, we come under attack pretty fast and find ourselves captain of a starving crew that has just mutinied, only to then be attacked by pirates themselves, barely making it out of all of that alive. And then, of course, having to get set up properly in Japan itself. But before we do any of that, we have to actually start the game, which first involves picking a difficulty. So they have 4 difficulties: story, normal, hard, or insane. You can also choose combat death, which is just stricter guidelines for your characters dying in combat, which will cause the combat itself to fail, by the way. But this is just basically how hard the game is going to be. But following that, we of course get character creation, which I think is a good time to talk a little bit about the graphics. In the couple of places that I've talked about this game already, I specifically mentioned that I wasn't too sure about the way the game looked here compared to, say, Expeditions Rome. And I've got to say, I think seeing the game in motion, it's a bit better than I expected, but I will also say the thing that really seems to bother me specifically about this is that when you're actually in conversations and everything this time around, they insist on showing your actual character model that you would actually be running around the game with, as opposed to the portraits and stuff that they show in Expeditions Rome. And as a result, this has a slightly more almost cartoony feel to it that Rome does not have. Now, I am perfectly aware that some people prefer this to the portraits. I'm just pointing out with some specificity about why it irked me in particular. But I will again say, having actually played the game now, I'm less worried about it. I think it works out fine. But speaking of character creation, one of the first things you're going to do is pick a name for yourself, and this is where things get odd, because your last name is Flynn no matter what you do. And yet it is confirmed that, again, we're kind of being a stand-in for William Adams, but of course in a much more loose fashion, and I think you having an entirely different family name is probably going to really drive that home, but that is confirmed to be the case. Now, beyond that, we do have a cosmetic character creation, quite a few options in there. I would imagine with this being an early access release, this will probably expand as time goes on, but there's a fair few options in there already. Head, hair, beard, eyes, skin, tattoos, even some posture, which I thought was interesting. The posture or the demeanor basically allows you to change your facial expression as well as the size of your character, which I thought was kind of neat. And then, most importantly, we get to pick one of 4 classes. So, Expeditions Rome had some great turn-based combat, and I'm hopeful then that Samurai will as well, and that starts here. You're going to pick between Guardian, Marauder, Scoundrel, or Tactician. Guardian is your standard sort of warrior tank, or in this case probably a samurai, I would imagine, but Marauder is a ranged combatant, that being early guns or traditional bow and arrow as the time period would suggest, Scoundrel, which is your pretty typical rogue type, and then Tactician. Tactician is all about support, but I also wanted to mention before we moved on here, interestingly enough to me anyway, it does look like that your companions this time around have a more varied approach to classes than you do. Like they still kind of fall into these archetypes, but they've got a little extra going on, which I think is going to help them differentiate themselves. But speaking of companions, much of the early game mission is basically tutorializing you on the ship that you start the game on, introducing things like combat mechanics, how exploration and everything is going to work, but it also introduces you to the bulk of your companions. I don't believe I've seen the full roster of all of them yet, but we get a look at characters like Reyna, who is the combat medic, Payet, who is your big tank guy, Etienne, who is a priest but also a support character, Johan, your duelist type, your rogue companion, Antija, and all of these characters play important roles in combat and out of it. Out of combat, they'll be bringing with their own skill sets and everything, so this being a CRPG, exploration and alternative options play a big role here. We see some of that play out just in the content available by giving you different approaches to solve your problems. Some of those skills are going to allow you to, say, talk your way out of a problem. There are things that will allow you to, say, pick lock or sneak, allowing you to enter restricted areas and potentially steal things for alternative quest rewards, or simply interact with your environment via things like, say, survival. And all of those skills, as you start leveling up, will give you options for just the various things you'll be encountering as you move through the game. And as your characters level up from questing or combat, of course, they're going to gain access to skills as well as class perks and bonuses, alongside upgrading their gear along the way. Now, the skills are broken down into your power, finesse, perception, and wits, and you have seemingly 4 points per level to spend on these, and then in addition to that, every time you gain a level, you grab some perk or ability points. Now, I thought these were interesting in particular because they seem to share the same resource pool. That is to say, you split the same points between either abilities or perks for your given character here. So abilities are straight from your class. These are things that you can upgrade and get access to provide you more of the things for your chosen class. Slightly different, however, are perks. Perks are a little more universal than that, in that there's a lot of basic ones that everybody has access to, like, for instance, various upgrades to the equipment. Like, for instance, becoming proficient in your armor or weapons, which allows you to access their, individual special abilities to make use of them in combat. Or just other little bonuses like increasing your range or individual little perks based on the skills and things it seems that you would have already picked up. So how you allocate your skills seems to give access to different availability of these perks for the individual characters. So curious to see how that'll play out over the course of the entire game. But nonetheless, let's move on a little bit to combat. So as you would probably expect, combat is a turn-based affair, but you have some options. First of all, I mentioned there is stealth, and that is an approach. I don't know if it's full-on a way for you to complete the entire game, but it is possible to separate your party and utilize individuals who, say, have more or less stealth in order to sneak up, knock out enemies, loot things, traverse restricted areas for potentially non-combat solutions altogether, but also to, if you cannot outright incapacitate a target, say, start them with significantly lower health for the rest of the battle. And that's the kind of thing you can do before the game shifts into a proper turn-based mode. Now, in turn-based mode, if you've played Expeditions Rome, or truth be told, much of any turn-based game, you'll likely get the gist. Every turn you get a couple of action points as well as movement points, and this is going to let you attack enemies accordingly. Now, enemies have a armor bar as well as their actual health bar. Armor, in this case, only applies to actual melee attacks. It really doesn't do anything to stop guns, as you would expect, and that's down to the game's cover system. So there will be various cover and everything, and the main way to get away from ranged enemies is to break their line of sight, utilizing cover. You also have to worry about things like glancing blows and whatnot, so you may want to flank and use some tactics to basically get around things like cover to make sure you're maximizing damage to the enemies you're about to hit. And while you're doing all of that, each of these classes individually has their own class last resource they have to worry about. Guardians is pretty straightforward. That's basically just their armor. Whereas other characters, to get the most out of them, you want to start their turn near allies in order to boost, I believe it was called coordination. Other characters will have to build up stuff like focus. And then there are other systems still, such as morale. Morale is pretty straightforward, but as things start to go poorly for the enemy, their morale will drop, that kind of thing. And while I didn't get the opportunity to mess around with it too much, there's also going to be some environmental interactions. So outside of doing things on your end, like say holding on to various items and chucking them at the enemy for various effects, there were fights where you could do things like attack lanterns, which could then drop onto oiled surfaces in order to catch everything on fire and create a sort of battlefield situation. With that fire, you would have to then work your way around. And that, combined with things like weapon abilities and everything, is, I would say, already feeling pretty familiar as somebody who's played Expeditions Rome. But I also want to point out that one of the things I thought when playing Rome, or at least beginning to play it, I should say, is that it might be hard to make combat interesting if all you're doing is using pretty standard weapons, etc. And I think one of the things that makes Expeditions Rome and the Expedition series so great is that they managed to make the combat set in a real-world setting still interesting enough to actually be engaging, and that's on top of all the historical stuff you can get lost in. And bringing all of that together, I will say Expedition Samurai here is looking pretty promising, a little better than I initially thought when I first got a glimpse of it. There's certainly a lot of potential here, but again, it is launching into early access, so it will be a little while before we actually wind up seeing this game in full. However, maybe not as long as we might think, because according to their estimates, what they are shooting for is a Q1 2027 release, which would put this roughly 6 months away, given exactly where in Q1 they want to launch it. February is probably the most likely. Nothing really releases in January, though I suppose March is certainly possible. But regardless of when it actually releases, obviously expect me to cover it. I'm very interested in seeing what they do with this one, and if they can sort of recapture the magic that was Expeditions Rome, because as I have already alluded to, we have seen takes on this particular bit of Japanese history via other games who take a more supernatural approach like Neo. And just this period of Japan's history is a pretty popular one to make media about. And all of that just makes for a situation that it will be curious to see if they can wind up pulling it off, but again, pretty promising thus far. But that is going to do it for this early look at Expedition Samurai. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.